Start?
Go ahead.
Well, good morning, Dumbarton. And, Dumbarton has been striving earnestly to be an anti-racist church, not only to be anti-racist church, to be an activist anti-racist church. Our speaker this morning has devoted her entire life to the civil rights movement and to anti-racist activism, nonviolent, direct action to address the legacy of slavery and of this original sin that has vexed and haunted America for centuries. So it's a great privilege for me to be able to present my friend, and I'm grateful to her in the midst of everything else she's doing to join us for our adult ed. Her name is Mary King, and about 25 years ago, she wrote this book, The Freedoms. Can everybody see that?
No. Okay. We need
Freedom Song.
Okay.
I hope you can see it.
Okay. Thank you.
But the book, with every page, you will grow in your admiration and respect for Mary King. It's an amazing personal narrative of her journey through the civil rights movement, starting as a very young woman working for SNCC. I first met Mary when she was on the board of a group called the ARCA Foundation, when she did a site visit with the organization that I was working for to determine whether we should be eligible and qualify for a grant from this foundation. And then subsequently, I joined the board of this organization, thanks in large part, I think, to her advocacy. So she and I have the privilege of sitting on this board, and Mary and I have been thinking about how we can move the board toward addressing atonement for past atrocities. And I think that's something that will resonate with our congregation. So Mary is Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Peace, main campus, Costa Rica. She also served as an academic advisor to the Africa program, a qualitative political science. She is also a distinguished Rothermere American Institute Fellow at Oxford, University of Oxford in the UK. She worked while in SNCC. She worked alongside the SCLC, led by Dr. King. And these two groups were particularly notable for the reliance on nonviolent direct action. And she, as I say, she wrote this autobiographical book, which is just magnificent. And she works also, she's had a long association with a Methodist because she comes from a long line of Methodist preachers going way, way back, generations, which of course endears her to me. And she currently is working with the James Lawson Institute. Perhaps many of you know James Lawson, Methodist clergy, who was in Nashville, very involved in training the first generation of young people, including Diane Nash, for the sit-ins in Nashville, Tennessee. So I have profound affection for Dr. King, Dr. Mary King. And so I could talk about her for a long time. I'm not going to talk about her anymore because I think we're all going to want to hear what she has to say. So Mary, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, and good morning to all of you who are there, whether I can see you or not. I'm delighted to be with you because, of course, growing up in a Methodist parsonage, I feel I have constant immediate rapport with you. In fact, my father was the 8th Methodist minister in 6 generations in Virginia and North Carolina. And then he decided that he did not want a church in the South. He wanted his church to be a church of all nations, all people. And so he moved to the New York Conference. And he met my mother, who was from Colombia, South America, and a nursing student at Presbyterian Hospital. And they married. And he enjoyed his congregations in Manhattan and elsewhere in New York City because of the immense diversity of the population. So you can imagine what I was growing up with, a kind of zeal and delight in diversity permeated our house. I never heard a word against any people or any group ever. So it's quite easy for me to be consistent with that. And I have been consistent with that perspective for the rest of my life, and have worked to make that broader and broader in the United States. My father also did a doctorate at Union Theological Seminary, and there he worked with Powell Telick and Reinhold Niebuhr. So it's really a joy to be with you. Now, for my part, I chose Ohio Wesleyan because of its fine English department. And of course, at that time, television news was covering the Southern student sit-ins, which were spreading down the coastal South. Let me mention that a sit-in is not just a lot of people showing up and sitting down. The potency of a sit-in is when you're asked to leave and you refuse to leave. So these sit-ins were spreading across the South, and they would eventually not only desegregate public accommodations throughout the South, they would lead to downtown campaigns to desegregate shopping areas and stores. Black families could not try clothing on children to see if it fit before they went to school. Women could not try on dresses. Men could not try on shoes. All of that had to be dealt with, and no one else was doing it. And so students, most of them in their 20s, did that for us, for all of us in the United States. So when at Ohio Wesleyan, as I watched and others watched what was happening by the Southern students, I organized a student committee on race relations. And sometimes we'd have 200 students show up for it. We raised money for the sit-ins. And then we decided it was important to learn more about it. And several professors gathered a group of students together, including myself. And we traveled by station wagon to Nashville and Atlanta, Tuskegee, other places. And I was able to meet extraordinary people like John Lewis and Julian Bond and Jim Foreman, who was the executive secretary of SNCC, and theologian Will Campbell, senior editor at the Atlanta Constitution, Miss Ella Baker, and Professor Howard Zinn. Now, when I got back to Ohio Wesleyan after that trip, I was waiting in the bus station, getting ready to go home after graduation. And a call was diverted from the dormitory. And the voice calling from Atlanta said, "Could you fly to North Carolina tonight to be interviewed by Miss Ella Baker and Professor Howard Zinn?" And I said, yes. And then I called home and told my parents I was not coming home. I was flying to North Carolina. So, but I am the child that they reared, and that was the action I had to take at that moment. Now, who is Ella Baker and who is Howard Zinn? Miss Baker is still underrated for the immensity of her role in 20th century social change. She was the granddaughter of slaves, and she is very, very deeply honed in efforts in the 1930s and the 1940s. In the 1940s, she traveled alone in Mississippi, developing NAACP chapters. But she's one of the great social philosophers that we've had in the United States. Very influential in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. Howard Zinn was a historian. He was a pilot in World War II. These were the two senior advisors at that time to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And what was that? Well, in April 1st, 1960, Miss Baker convened leaders of all the Southern student campaigns, the sit-in campaigns, at her alma mater. in North Carolina. And they organized together. Martin Luther King was there, Jim Lawson was there and led the group from Nashville along with Diane Nash. But they formed a committee of student leaders from the sit-ins. And Miss Baker's influence was profound. I talk about her a great deal in Freedom Song. By the end of the first year, 70,000 young adults had participated in sit-ins in the South, and 3,600 of them had gone to jail. And actually, SNCC had the largest paid staff of any civil rights organization in the 1960s. This will surprise you. Of course, I only got $9.64 a week after taxes. we were all paid, even if it was not much. Miss Baker had a very strong philosophy of leadership, and she was profoundly committed to women's participation, but she has accepted that women would be treated as second class and decided to emphasize instead an expansion of democratic leadership, and I mean democracy with a lowercase d, rather than promoting women's rights or women's participation. She promoted a profound vision of leadership in which leadership could be found anywhere. And it was the job of the organizer to discern, to see that someone had natural gifts for leadership, and then to work with them and to develop them. And she therefore had a profound influence throughout the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is, as I said, is the largest staffed civil rights organization in the 1960s. She would say to us, leadership can be found everywhere. The organizer's role is to see leadership potential in others, not to glorify themselves. She would also often tell me when I was working with her, because I began working with her and Howard Zinn on workshops that allowed white and Black students from colleges and universities to come together. This was a first in the United States. And it was led by Miss Baker and Howard Zinn. And the money came from the Field Foundation, the department store in Chicago. And we would have workshops in which banned or forbidden topics were approached. For example, students wanting to know, how can such poor Southern states afford to have two systems of education? How are we spending our money? And they would get no answers on questions like that from their university professors. The professors were not allowed to talk about things like that. The South had sacrificed academic freedom in order to protect its racial segregation and racism. And we today have states who are doing precisely the same thing, sacrificing academic freedom. No, you can't read that book. Book burning started in Spotsylvania County, the county in which I live in Virginia, just a couple of months ago, recently. And so now we're reverting to that sacrifice of academic freedom in order to promote segregation and negative views of certain people. So I started volunteering in the SNCC office on weekends when I wasn't working on the workshops with Ms. Baker and Jim and Professor Zinn. And as a result, Jim Perman, who was the director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, got to know me, and he found out I had been an English major at Ohio Wesleyan. And he said, oh, good, you'll be able to write news releases. I'm sending you to Danville, Virginia tonight. And I said, Jim, I don't know how to write a press release. I have no idea how to do it. He said, oh, never mind, you'll figure it out. And he sent me alone to Danville, Virginia, where we had an extraordinarily destructive city leadership that used immense and extraordinary violence on a very, very well organized and well planned local movement for jobs and the vote that was led by several Black clergy. And on June 10, 1963, police snaked huge coils of fire hoses onto the city hall steps And as 65 disciplined marchers walked with immense dignity, I was right there watching so that I could work with the press, because that was my job. I had to do that. That's what Jim wanted. But the fire hoses were only 15 feet from people's faces. And the impact of water coming from a fire hose is devastating. It rips off clothing, breaks bones, punctures skin, fractures skulls, enucleates eyeballs. And they were also beaten with clubs. 48 out of the 65 disciplined marchers were hospitalized. This is Danville, Virginia, 1963. There was a Methodist Institute, Randolph-Macon Institute. My father actually studied there, even though it was a girls' school, because he was the son of the pastor. He got to go to Randolph-Macon Institute. So this is what the South was, and this is what the South seems to want to be again, and they bring the rest of the country with it. Perhaps we'll have some discussion of that. In 1963, I want to mention that we got a phone call saying that the newly installed ambassador to the United Nations from the newly independent country of Kenya would like to come to Atlanta and meet people working in the civil rights movement. But the State Department told us he must fly from one airport to the other. He wants to drive by car. We cannot let him do that. I said, why can't you let him do that? And they said, because we cannot protect him. We cannot assure his safety driving to Atlanta. Hold on to that and think about it later, what that means, that the federal government in 1963 could not protect the safety of a Black diplomat who wanted to see the countryside as he drove through the United States. So in midsummer, I was still in Danville. One of our movement lawyers, we called them movement lawyers. They were lawyers who were specializing in helping the civil rights movement, raced to my desk. He told me that I was about to be indicted by a grand jury for inciting to acts of violence and war. That language comes from the statute that held it illegal to incite the colored population to acts of violence and war against the white population. That was legislation that was passed in Virginia after the 1831 Nat Turner slave uprising in Southampton County, Virginia. It also was the basis, along with treason, for hanging John Brown after Harper's Ferry. A Danville Black funeral director had to squirrel me out of Danville in his large car. It wasn't the hearse, but it was another large car that he had where I could collapse and not be seen. And he took me across the Dan River into North Carolina, where a Roman Catholic convent took me in, fed me, and let me sleep for a few days. And then I made my way back to Atlanta. So in June 1964, I was sent to Mississippi to work on Mississippi Freedom Summer, in which we had enlisted about 1,200 volunteers who were teachers for the freedom schools, lawyers, clergy, physicians, nurses, many different professions from all over the country. Random violence striking anywhere in Mississippi was something we lived with all the time, and I knew that. And so this is when I really began the conversations with myself as to whether I was ready to die for my beliefs. And in fact, all of us working in Mississippi had those deep conversations with ourselves. Now, long before anyone had ever heard of Martin Luther King, a steady flow of Black leaders was traveling to India, 12,000 miles by steamer ship, to study the Indian independence struggles. And some of them met with Gandhi. For example, a Methodist bishop named Edward Carroll, Black Methodist bishop, who was a friend of my parents. He met Gandhi in, I believe it was 1936. So this was exceedingly important because it brought knowledge that Gandhi had been testing and experimenting in India directly into the Black community in the middle part of the Atlantic coastline, where Black communities began learning how to prepare for dealing with their own caste system. That's how they looked at racism, as a caste system that they had to put up with. And while Gandhi had been in India, he had also figured out, when he was still in his 30s, that no system could stand if the people refused to obey it or cooperate with it. And the strongest nonviolent method that he developed is called non-cooperation. He also coined all the words we use, the words that Joe used in the introduction, nonviolent direct action. All of those terms are Gandhi coinage in English for English speakers. Basically, he realized that no system could rule if the people refused to cooperate with it. And that's the core power that's used in nonviolent struggle. Now, in nonviolent struggles, the action taken is much more important than the personal beliefs. People come into campaigns, movements with all sorts of beliefs, all sorts of convictions. What counts is that they will obey the rules, that they will agree to the nonviolent discipline, that they will not retaliate. Any breaking of that discipline hands the victory to the opponent. The only way for an unarmed group to win, and they win over and over again because observers are horrified by well-armed security and police or others going against people who are mothers pushing babies and uncles carrying nephews and ordinary people who stand before them, despite the fact that they are unarmed against armed security and police. So these are among the things that we were learning actively from Gandhi, and they're still core. There are thousands of nonviolent struggles. We have more nonviolent struggle today than we had at any other time in history, highly successful in most instances. What Gandhi said is, I admit there is a doubtful proportion of full believers in my theory of nonviolence. In other words, I know not everybody goes along with my strict regimen, but I also know that I don't need believers in nonviolence. All I need is people who will carry out the rules of nonviolent action. So we don't ask anyone, what do you believe before you get involved in a nonviolent action? All we ask is, can you abide by these rules? If not, go make the sandwiches for lunch. Or if not, go and drive these people who can't get from the train station. So I'm coming toward the end of what I'm going to say, and we're going to move to questions, I hope. One of the things that perturbs me greatly is that neither United States public school systems nor the academy, by which I mean our colleges and universities, is studying or learning about nonviolent action. It is not taught in our public schools. And I assure you that celebrating Martin Luther King's birthday once a year is not the way to teach young people that there are powers that have nothing to do with violence that are able to make phenomenal change in societies. Thousands of nonviolent campaigns in the United States have succeeded, and they've not been documented. For example, child labor was eradicated in 1903 when an Irish emigre social worker who called herself Mother Jones led 300 child laborers from Philadelphia walking to President Theodore Roosevelt's summer home in New York State. And many of the children had missing limbs and missing digits from child labor. Many of them had been given to the industrialists in order to work their lives out. President Roosevelt refused to meet with the children, but the press coverage along the route was so immense that child labor was eradicated very, very rapidly. This is only one example I'm going to give you right this second, but it's a very indicative example. Abolition of slavery. You mentioned slavery, Joe, in the beginning. This was probably the largest nonviolent struggle in the history of our country. This is one thing we can be very proud of. It was done without arms. This does not mean that there were not slave uprisings, but the abolition of slavery was fought with nonviolent means. And nonviolent struggles have secured so many things we can't possibly mention them all. A study from Yale holds that 7 million Americans are ready for civil disobedience in order to defend climate justice. And right now, there are 15,000 Russians, according to the Wall Street Journal. And this is old, this is about 4 days old. There are 14,000 Russians who are under detention in Russia for refusing to cooperate. They're using Gandhi's non-cooperation with Putin and the military there, and they are facing 15-year terms of treason. Now, we also have evidence that countries that experience bottom-up grassroots nonviolent struggle are more likely to sustain human rights and democracy once established than when armed insurrection is used. There's a group of quantitative, Joe said I'm a qualitative political scientist. That's the correct technical term. It means that I do very deep case studies, working to understand the workings of nonviolent struggle, because it is a form of power that has brought down or collapsed or disintegrated many dictatorships in the last few years. Ferdinand Marcos, for example, a national revolution. They coined the word people power. The churches read Gandhi and King 24 hours a day during the last several days in 1986 before the Marcos dictatorship collapsed. It literally disintegrated as a result of national nonviolent struggle in which priests and nuns were kneeling in front of the US military bases. A lot of symbolism in nonviolent action. But at any rate, this group at Harvard is doing a lot of work on maintaining a count on all of these things. And I want to just mention fairly briefly, you all remember George Floyd, and how he was arrested on suspicion of using a counterfeit $20 bill and then was murdered by Derek Chauvin. The Harvard team has actually counted something like 10,000 city and county demonstrations that occurred. And once all the data is processed from May to August in 2020, they expect to find more than 95% of the events during that time were nonviolent. And this is what they've also found. This is a team of 9 political scientists at Harvard. When violence was used after George Floyd, it tended to be against the demonstrators and was conducted by police or counter protesters. So even if we're not teaching nonviolent struggle, something happened at that moment in which there were possibly a very, very large number of demonstrations that were untutored. Black Lives Matter was doing a lot of work, but they don't have strong background in this field either. This is a recent thing for them. So one reason for having a thoughtful adult education program such as you have at Dumbarton, which is so wonderful. One of my brothers used to be a congregant at Dumbarton, is that it can help you to be ready. If you have determined what you stand for, it can help you to be ready should a door suddenly open for you, the way a door opened for me that day at Ohio Wesleyan when I got the phone call, would I fly to North Carolina to be interviewed by Miss Baker and Howard Zinn. And the needs for people and cultures to know their own histories of nonviolent action is critical. It's completely unacceptable to me that US school children do not learn about this while we study war after war after war after war. What both Gandhi and Martin Luther King called an operative technique, that's the term that they both used for nonviolent action, has established many human rights in this country, and it's affected our Constitution. Human rights are produced through processes of nonviolent action. They may be codified in Switzerland or at The Hague by lawyers, but those lawyers have not studied the nonviolent action that has produced those human rights. This is a deficit, and there is a lawyer that I'm encouraging to do a major book on this topic. Human rights get produced through nonviolent action, and then they get codified, and then they have influenced our Constitution. But this is something way beyond our time limit today. So the last thing I want to say before we go to questions is that my experience in SNCC was actually the closest that I shall ever be to direct democracy, because we made all major decisions by consensus, which means that you talk and you analyze until there is finally no objection. Every issue has been addressed and resolved. And finally, you have agreement that we can go forward. It is extremely time consuming.
Wait. Hang on, Mary. We got to
Let's
do
see,
something.
this is, okay, can you hear me at least, Mary?
Yes, I
Okay.
can.
We have set up for worship service that is going on upstairs. And so we had an interruption on what people are seeing here in the studio. I think that it is still okay for people who are on Zoom. Is that correct? You see some head nods. Okay. We will see if we can have some questions and then hear your finally after that. So let's first go to, I will ask if someone has a question or comment to come on over here to.
I have a quick
Okay,
comment,
fine.
and that is this, Mary, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
You know, this church has been very interested in the Middle East, particularly, you know, the rights of Palestinians. Mary, I want to recommend a book called A Quiet Revolution, which is about the efforts of the Palestinians to develop and engage in a nonviolent resistance to Israeli occupation and domination. And watch it be, I'm sure it's painful, watch it be co-opted, frankly, by the PLO and by Yasser Arafat and others. But it's a wonderful book. I recommend it for those of us who are interested in Israel-Palestine. A Quiet Revolution by Mary King.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask if first the people who are here in person, if anybody wants to come over and ask a question or make a comment. Have anybody here? Okay, then I'll ask in chat if we have anyone who wants to, we can probably just do it by speaking up. I'll change for a moment to gallery view. Does anyone who is on chat have a comment?
You'll need to unmute.
Yes, thank you, Roger. Okay, Mary, I think we can go to your finally comments then, since we're back together here.
Yeah, I was actually really at the end. I wanted to mention how profoundly affected I was by that process of seeking consensus when you have, I mean, I was in my early 20s. You know, all of us were in our early 20s. Jim Foreman was in his 30s. He's a school teacher from Chicago who had grown up in Mississippi. He was our executive director in SNCC. But all of us were in our 20s. And we would discuss sometimes, once we had a meeting that lasted for 3 days and 2 nights. And I would have to be honest with you and say that the decision was finally made by those who were still awake. But even so, that was a very, very profoundly important experience that I had. I am absolutely unafraid of groups that disagree and are willing to engage honestly and openly about it. I have no fears, and I believe that the outcome will be good if it's with mutual with mutual respect, it can be very clarifying and very strengthening. And the only other thing that I had to say is that almost everything I've done since the movement days has been affected by that experience, that very profound experience. Thank you for catching that, Joe.
Can you say something about the James Lawson Institute?
Well, the James Lawson Institute is something that was developed by Reverend Lawson some years ago as a way of providing in-depth preparation and knowledge of planning for nonviolent action. One cannot teach somebody else how to do their own strategy, but one can give them the tools for thinking about the objectives, what can be accomplished, when it can be accomplished. Is it in stages of 3 or 4, or can you do it all at once? And so he developed a method for working with leaders and organizers in which we have presentations by people who are usually scholar practitioners, people like me, people who have a tremendous background of experience, tangible experience, but then who have gone on to study, how does this work? How do we refine it? How do we make it able to do more complex jobs that the normal institutions of politics have not taken upon themselves to do? How do we reverse dreadful developments that have occurred in this society? How do we end the tenure of that despot and do it without a single drop of blood? So those are the kinds of questions we put before ourselves. Usually there will be about 44 or 45 people in a James Lawson Institute. And now Vanderbilt University in Nashville is developing an institute named after Reverend Lawson that is going to anchor that in Vanderbilt University. We will continue to take institutes out to various parts of the country. We're already talking about doing one at the University of San Francisco potentially, and we're talking about doing another at, perhaps I shouldn't mention it because it's not been cleared yet, another university in the East. But it's very much hands-on, although what we focus on is theory, history, and practice.